I stood in the lobby of St. Catherine's emergency shelter, clutching a garbage bag containing everything I owned, watching my daughter-in-law Stephanie drive away in her BMW without so much as a backward glance. The intake worker looked at me, with practiced sympathy, probably thinking here was another elderly woman whose family had abandoned her. What she didn't know, what Stephanie didn't know, was that I had built this shelter with my own hands 23 years ago. In fact, I owned this one and 49 others across 3 states. But as I signed my name on the intake form, I decided to let them all keep thinking I was just another broken-down old woman with nowhere else to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Ruth Ann Bailey, and for 72 years, I've learned that people show you exactly who they are when they think you have nothing left to offer them. I spent 40 years building a fortune in commercial real estate, starting with a single rundown apartment building I bought with my late husband's life insurance money. By the time I retired at 65, I owned a portfolio worth over $30 million, including a chain of homeless shelters that had helped thousands of people get back on their feet. I kept my wealth private, living modestly in a small house, driving an old Honda, shopping at thrift stores not out of necessity but because I believed in living below my means. Money, I had learned, changed people's behavior toward you, and I preferred to be loved for who I was, not what I owned. When my son David married Stephanie 5 years ago, I welcomed her into our family with open arms. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed to adore my boy. David worked as a high school teacher, making decent money but nothing extravagant, and Stephanie worked part-time at a boutique while pursuing what she called her wellness coaching certification. I thought she was lovely, perhaps a bit materialistic, but David was happy, and that was all that mattered to me. I helped them with their wedding, quietly paying for the reception venue when their budget came up short. I never told them it was me. I just had the venue coordinator call and say they'd received an anonymous gift. That was how I preferred to help my family, quietly and without expecting recognition. After they married, I made it a point to give them space to build their life together. I called once a week, visited for holidays, and always came bearing homemade cookies or a casserole for their freezer. Stephanie seemed to appreciate my cooking, often asking for recipes, and I was delighted to share the dishes my own mother had taught me. I babysat their golden retriever, Buster, whenever they went on weekend trips, and I loved having that sweet dog's company in my quiet house. David would joke that I spoiled Buster more than I'd ever spoiled him, and he wasn't. Wrong. I'd take that dog to the pet store and let him pick out toys, much to the amusement of the other shoppers who saw this elderly woman letting a golden retriever carry a shopping basket in his mouth. The first sign that something was shifting came about 2 years into their marriage. I had offered to host Thanksgiving dinner, as I had done every year since David was born. It was our tradition, one I treasured, and I spent weeks planning the menu, shopping for ingredients, and preparing my grandmother's china. The week before Thanksgiving, Stephanie called to tell me they'd decided to spend the holiday with her parents in Scottsdale instead. She explained that her father had been having some health issues and they wanted to be there for him. I understood completely and told her to give her parents my best wishes. But something in her tone felt different, cooler somehow, like she was delivering news rather than having a conversation. Christmas that year was similarly distant. They came for dinner, but Stephanie spent most of the time on her phone, photographing the food and texting. When I asked about her wellness coaching, she sighed and said it was harder than she'd expected to build a client base. I offered to help connect her with some of the women I knew from my volunteer work at the community center, but she waved me off, saying she needed to find her own path. David seemed oblivious to the tension I was sensing, chatting happily about his students and the new curriculum he was developing. I pushed my concerns aside, telling myself that young couples needed time to establish their own traditions. The change became more pronounced over the following months. Phone calls grew shorter and less frequent. When I called, Stephanie would answer with a clipped, "David's not here right now," and promise to have him call me back, which he did, but often not until the next day. When I suggested getting together for dinner, there was always a reason why it wouldn't work. They were busy with Stephanie's new fitness routine, or David was coaching the debate team, or they had plans with Stephanie's friends. I began to feel like I was imposing, like my presence in their lives had become a burden rather than a joy. I started noticing other small changes when I did see them. Stephanie had upgraded her wardrobe, wearing designer clothes and carrying expensive handbags. Their modest apartment had been redecorated with furniture that looked far beyond a teacher's salary. When I complimented a beautiful new coffee table, Stephanie mentioned casually that it was from a high-end boutique downtown, but when I asked how they were managing such nice purchases, she became evasive, mentioning something about David picking up tutoring work. I didn't push, but I couldn't help wondering where the money was really coming from. The shift accelerated when they bought their house. It was a beautiful property in an upscale neighborhood with granite countertops, hardwood floors, and a 3-car garage. David called me, excited to share the news, and I was genuinely thrilled for them. Home ownership was such an important milestone, and I remembered how proud my late husband and I had been when we bought our first little house all those years. Ego. But when David mentioned the purchase price, my heart sank. There was no way they could afford a $400,000 house on their combined income, not without help. When I gently asked about the financing, David became uncomfortable, mumbling something about a special first-time buyer program and Stephanie's family helping with the down payment. I should have been more direct, should have asked harder questions, but I didn't want to seem intrusive or judgmental. These were grown adults making their own decisions, and I had raised David to be responsible with money. If they said they could afford it, I chose to trust them. Looking back now, I realize that was my first mistake. I was so concerned with respecting their independence that I ignored the warning signs that should have been obvious to someone with my business experience. The housewarming party was when I truly understood how much had changed. Stephanie had invited dozens of people I'd never met, mostly her new friends from the country club she'd somehow joined. The house was beautifully decorated, with catered food and a bartender mixing cocktails. Everyone was dressed expensively, talking about their vacation homes and investment portfolios. I felt completely out of place in my simple dress and cardigan, clutching a casserole dish that suddenly seemed embarrassingly homemade next to the elegant spread Stephanie had arranged. What hurt most was how Stephanie introduced me to her friends. "This is David's mother," she would say, without warmth or elaboration, as if I were a distant relative who had to be acknowledged but not celebrated. When one of her friends asked what I did, Stephanie answered before I could speak, saying I was retired and lived quietly in the old part of town. There was something dismissive in her tone, as if my modest lifestyle was somehow embarrassing to her. I caught David watching this exchange with a troubled expression, but he didn't correct her or add anything about my volunteer work or the life I'd built for myself. During the party, I overheard Stephanie talking to a group of women about how exhausting it was to manage all the family obligations that came with marriage. She complained about having to include older relatives in their social plans and how it limited their ability to do the things they really wanted to do. One of the women laughed and said she'd learned to set boundaries early in her marriage, and Stephanie nodded enthusiastically, saying she was working on that too. I stood in their beautiful kitchen, surrounded by strangers eating food I hadn't contributed to, and realized that I had become the family obligation Stephanie was trying to manage. The exclusion became more systematic after that. Birthday dinners were celebrated at restaurants I wasn't invited to, with photos posted on social media showing happy groups of people I didn't recognize. Holiday plans were made without consulting me, and I learned about them through casual mentions in our increasingly brief phone conversations. When I suggested visits, Stephanie would explain that they were so busy with their new lifestyle, their fitness classes, their social commitments, She made it sound like they were living this incredibly full and exciting life that simply didn't have room for a quiet elderly woman who enjoyed cooking and gardening. I tried talking to David directly, calling him at work to suggest father-son activities that wouldn't require Stephanie's participation. We managed a few lunch dates, and during those meals, I caught glimpses of the son I recognized. He would tell me about his students, ask about my garden, laugh at my stories about Buster's latest mischief. But even then, I could sense he was distracted, checking his phone frequently, always aware of the time. When I asked how things were going at home, he would smile and say everything was great, but something in his eyes suggested otherwise. The money questions started coming about 6 months after they bought the house. David called one evening, his voice strained, asking if I might be able to help them out with some unexpected expenses. The roof needed repairs, he said, and their insurance wasn't covering as much as they'd hoped. I offered to give them the money outright, but David insisted it would be a loan, that they would pay me back within 6 months. I transferred $5,000 to their account the next day, happy to help my son when he needed it. When I asked if everything else was okay financially, he assured me it was just a temporary setback, but the requests kept coming. Car repairs, medical bills, property taxes that were higher than expected. Each time David called personally, apologetically, promising it was the last time and that they would start paying me back soon. I gave them the money without hesitation, not because I couldn't afford it, but because I loved them and wanted to help. What I didn't realize was that these weren't emergency requests. They were funding a lifestyle that required constant financial support, and I had become their primary source of that support. It was Stephanie's birthday dinner that opened my eyes to what was really happening. David had invited me to join them at an expensive steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where appetizers cost more than I usually spent on an entire meal. I dressed carefully in my best outfit, looking forward to celebrating with my family. But when I arrived, I found them with a table full of friends, all dressed in designer clothes, ordering multiple bottles of wine that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a week. The bill for that dinner must have been close to $1,000, and I watched David pay it without hesitation, using a credit card I'd never seen before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later, when I mentioned the expensive dinner and asked how they were managing to pay for such things while still needing help with basic expenses, David became defensive. He said they deserved to enjoy life while they were young, that they worked hard and shouldn't have to live like paupers just because money was tight sometimes. When I gently suggested that perhaps they could scale back their social spending until they were more financially stable, he accused me of not understanding their generation's approach to work-life balance. The conversation ended with both of us frustrated and hurt, and I realized that the son I'd raised to value financial responsibility had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. That was when I began to understand that Stephanie hadn't just married David, she had transformed him. The modest, thoughtful young man who used to volunteer at soup kitchens and drive his car until it literally wouldn't run anymore had become someone who thought nothing of spending my money on luxury dinners while complaining about not being able to afford roof repairs. I had unwittingly enabled this transformation by providing financial support without asking hard questions about how that money was being used. The realization that I was being taken advantage of came gradually, then all at once. The promises to pay me back stopped coming. The requests for money became demands, delivered not with apology, but with expectation. When I hesitated to transfer money for what David called a financial emergency that turned out to be funding for a weekend trip to wine country, Stephanie called me herself for the first time in months. Her tone was cold and businesslike as she explained that family was supposed to support family, and that my reluctance to help was causing David stress that was affecting their marriage. That phone call was a turning point for me. For the first time, I clearly saw the dynamic that had developed. I had become an ATM for their lifestyle, valued only for my willingness to provide money without questions or conditions. My presence in their lives was tolerated as long as I continued to fund their choices, but my actual person, my feelings, my need for connection and family had become irrelevant. I was being used, systematically and deliberately, by people I loved unconditionally. But I still didn't understand how deep the manipulation went. I still believed that David was essentially the good person I'd raised, perhaps influenced by his wife's materialism, but not fundamentally changed. I still hoped that if I could just find the right way to communicate, if I could just be patient enough and loving enough, we could work through this difficult period and rebuild our relationship. I had no idea that what was coming would shatter not just my illusions about my family, but my entire sense of who I was and where I belonged in the world. The first hint of the disaster approaching came during what I thought was a routine family dinner. I had offered to cook, hoping to recreate some of the warmth we'd once shared, and surprisingly, they had accepted. I spent all day preparing David's favorite meals, setting the table with my good china, creating the kind of homey atmosphere I remembered from his childhood. When they arrived, I was hopeful that this might be the beginning of healing the distance that had grown between us. But something was wrong from the moment they walked in. Stephanie looked around my modest home with barely concealed disdain, commenting that I really should consider updating my decor and maybe hiring someone to help with the housework. David seemed nervous, checking his phone constantly and barely touching the food I'd spent hours preparing. The conversation was stilted and uncomfortable, with long silences that I tried desperately to fill with questions about their lives, their work, their plans for the future. It was during dessert that Stephanie dropped the bomb that would change everything. She looked across my dining room table, the same table where I'd helped David with homework for 12 years, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and all the small victories of daily life, and told me that they'd been talking about my living situation. My house was getting too big for me, she said, and they were worried about my safety living alone at my age. Wouldn't I be happier somewhere with other people? Somewhere with activities and support services designed for seniors? I was so stunned that I couldn't immediately respond. David wouldn't meet my eyes, pushing his pie around his plate while Stephanie continued talking about retirement communities and assisted living facilities. She had done research, she said, and found several places that looked very nice, very suitable for someone in my situation. The way she said my situation made it clear that she viewed me as a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be managed and relocated. When I finally found my voice, I told them that I was perfectly capable of living independently, that I loved my home and my neighborhood, that I had no intention of moving anywhere. I was 72, not 92, and I was in excellent health. I had friends in my community, volunteer commitments, a life that I had carefully built and that brought me joy. Why would I give all of that up to live in some institutional setting with strangers? That was when the real manipulation began. Stephanie's tone became patronizing as she explained that I might not be the best judge of my own capabilities. Older people often didn't recognize when they were becoming unsafe or inappropriate for independent living. She had noticed that I seemed more forgetful lately, more confused about social situations. David had mentioned that I sometimes repeated stories or forgot details we'd discussed in previous conversations. Perhaps it was time to consider that I needed more support than I was willing to admit. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his wife that there was nothing wrong with my memory or my judgment. But David remained silent, still focused on his untouched dessert, letting Stephanie speak for both of them. In that moment, I realized that this conversation had been planned, that they had discussed my situation and decided on their approach before coming to my house. I was being ambushed in my own dining room by people I had loved and supported unconditionally for years. The conversation continued for another hour, with Stephanie presenting her case like a prosecutor addressing a jury. She had brochures for several facilities, printouts of online reviews, even a list of questions I should ask when touring potential homes. She spoke about the benefits of socialization with people my own age, about the peace of mind that came with having medical staff available, about the activities and services that would enrich my daily life. Everything she said was delivered, with a smile and a tone of caring concern, but underneath it all was an unmistakable message. I was being told to leave my life behind, and my opinion about whether I wanted to do so was irrelevant. When they finally left that evening, I sat in my quiet house surrounded by the dishes from a meal that had been meant to bring us together, but had instead driven us further apart. I tried to make sense of what had happened, to understand how my own family could look at me and see someone who needed to be managed and relocated rather than loved and supported. I had raised David to be kind and respectful, to value family and to care for those who had cared for him. How had he become someone who could sit silently while his wife systematically dismantled my autonomy and dignity? That night, I barely slept. I walked through my house, looking at the life I had built there, the memories embedded in every room. This was where David had taken his first steps, where he had recovered from childhood illnesses, where we had celebrated his graduation from college. These walls held 40 years of our family's history, and now I was being told to pack it all up and move to some sterile facility where I could be monitored and managed like a child who couldn't be trusted to care for herself. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Stephanie called regularly with updates on her research, sending me links to websites and scheduling tours of facilities without consulting me first. She spoke about the process as if it were already decided, as if my resistance was just a temporary obstacle to be overcome with enough patience and persistence. When I tried to explain that I didn't want to move, she would sigh and say that change was always difficult, but that I would thank them later when I saw how much happier I was in a more appropriate environment. David's role in this campaign was more subtle but equally devastating. He would call with casual questions about my daily routine, asking whether I was eating properly, whether I was keeping up with housework, whether I ever felt lonely or overwhelmed. At first, I thought he was showing genuine concern for my well-being, but I gradually realized that my answers were being reported back to Stephanie and used as evidence that I needed supervised care. When I mentioned that I'd forgotten to water my garden one day, that became proof that I was neglecting my responsibilities. When I said I'd been feeling a bit tired, that became evidence that maintaining my household was becoming too much for me. The manipulation was so skillful that I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was more forgetful than I realized. Maybe my house was becoming too much for me to handle. Maybe they could see things about my condition that I couldn't see myself. I started questioning every decision, second-guessing every action, wondering if my insistence on independence was really just stubborn denial of my own limitations. It was during this period of self-doubt that the financial pressure intensified. The requests for money became more frequent and more urgent, always accompanied by reminders of how much easier it would be to manage my finances if I were in a facility where professionals could help me with such complicated matters. Stephanie suggested that it might be wise to consolidate my assets to simplify my financial life before making such a major transition. She offered to help me organize my paperwork to make sure all my accounts were properly managed and accessible. I was beginning to feel trapped, surrounded by people who claimed to love me, but were systematically dismantling my independence and autonomy. Every conversation felt like an interrogation, every interaction like a test I was somehow failing. I started withdrawing from my volunteer activities, partly because I was tired of defending my choices, and partly because I was afraid that any mistake or forgetfulness would be reported back to David and Stephanie as further evidence that I needed supervised care. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when I fell in my kitchen while reaching for a dish on a high shelf. It was a minor accident, just a stumble that resulted in a bruised hip and a scraped hand. But when Stephanie heard about it, she treated it like a medical emergency. She insisted on taking me to the hospital, where the doctors confirmed that I was fine, that falls were common at any age, and that there was no indication of any serious problem. But Stephanie took the medical report and twisted it into evidence that I was becoming a danger to myself. Within days, she had scheduled tours at 3 different facilities, telling me that the fall had made it clear that I could no longer live safely on my own. She spoke about the accident as if it were the inevitable result of my declining condition rather than a simple mishap that could have happened to anyone. When I protested that a single fall didn't mean I was incapacitated, she responded with a litany of other concerns. My forgetfulness, my social isolation, my inability to maintain my property properly, my confusion about financial matters. I realized then that I had been outmaneuvered. Every conversation we'd had, every question David had asked, every concern Stephanie had raised, had been building toward this moment. They had constructed a case against my independence so methodically that my own minor accident was now being presented as the final piece of evidence that I needed to be institutionalized. I was being gaslighted by my own family, made to feel incompetent and unsafe in the life I had built and maintained successfully for decades. The tours were humiliating experiences where Stephanie spoke about me as if I weren't there, discussing my needs and limitations with staff members who nodded sympathetically. The facilities were nice enough, clean and well-staffed, with activities and services designed to keep residents busy and content. But they weren't home, and they weren't my choice. I was being presented with options for a life I didn't want, in places I didn't choose, surrounded by people who didn't know me or care about the person I had been before I became a problem to be solved. Throughout this process, the financial requests continued and intensified. Now they weren't just asking for help with expenses. They were asking me to help them expand their lifestyle while simultaneously arguing that I was too incompetent to manage my own finances. The contradiction was staggering, but by then I was so worn down by the constant pressure that I could barely recognize the manipulation for what it was. That was my life in the months leading up to the morning when Stephanie would drive me to St. Catherine's emergency shelter and leave me there like a piece of unwanted furniture. I had become a problem to be managed, a source of funding to be exploited, and eventually, an inconvenience to be discarded. The son I had raised with love, and the daughter-in-law I had welcomed with open arms, had systematically stripped away my autonomy, my dignity, and finally, my home. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with. They saw a confused elderly woman with some money they could access and some property they could eventually inherit. What they didn't see was the woman who had built a real estate empire from nothing, who had created a network of homeless shelters that had helped thousands of people rebuild their lives, who had survived loss and hardship and challenged that, would have broken weaker spirits. They thought they were disposing of a burden. What they were actually doing was awakening a force they were completely unprepared to face. The morning it all came crashing down started like any other Tuesday. I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the familiar sounds of my neighborhood coming to life. Mrs. Henderson next door was watering her roses, the school bus was making its rounds, and the mail carrier was whistling his usual tune as he walked his route. I had no idea that by evening, I would be homeless, abandoned, and sitting in an intake office signing papers that labeled me as just another destitute senior with nowhere else to go. I was in my kitchen making coffee when Stephanie's car pulled into my driveway at exactly 8:30 in the morning. Through my window, I could see her checking her phone, her face set in that determined expression I had come to recognize as dangerous. She was dressed expensively as always, wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and carrying a leather handbag that gleamed in the morning sun. Everything about her appearance suggested success and competence, the kind of woman who got things done efficiently and without sentiment. When she knocked on my door, her smile was bright and artificial, the same smile she used when she wanted something from me. She breezed into my living room without waiting for an invitation, carrying a stack of papers and a manila folder that she placed on my coffee table with ceremonious importance. She had exciting news, she announced, settling into my favorite armchair as if she owned it. She had found the perfect place for me, a lovely facility that had just had an opening, and they were willing to accept me immediately. I stood in my own living room, still wearing my bathrobe, trying to process what she was telling me. The facility was called Golden Years Manor, she explained, and it was exactly what I needed. Private rooms, 3 meals a day, activities designed for people my age, and most importantly, professional staff who could monitor my health and safety around the clock. She had already completed most of the paperwork, she said, pulling forms from her folder with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for months. When I tried to object, to remind her that I had not agreed to move anywhere, Stephanie's expression shifted to the patronizing patience she reserved for what she considered my more difficult moments. She understood that change was scary, she said, especially for someone in my condition, but sometimes family had to make hard decisions for the people they loved. David was at work, she explained, but he had asked her to handle the arrangements because he found the whole situation too emotional to deal with directly. The papers she had brought were not suggestions or options for me to consider. They were completed forms requiring only my signature to finalize my admission to Golden Years Manor. She had listed herself and David as my emergency contacts and decision-makers, had provided medical information I had never authorized her to access, and had even included a financial assessment that somehow detailed assets and income I had never discussed with her. The thoroughness of her preparation was breathtaking and terrifying. As she spread the documents across my coffee table, explaining each section with the enthusiasm of someone describing vacation plans, I began to understand the scope of what was happening. This was not a family discussion about my future. This was a fait accompli, presented to me as a courtesy but not requiring my actual consent. They had decided my fate, completed the arrangements, and were now informing me of the decision they had made on my behalf. When I refused to sign the papers, Stephanie's patience began to fray around the edges. She had expected some resistance, she said, but she had hoped I would be reasonable about this. The facility was expecting me today, she explained, and there would be complications if we delayed much longer. She had already arranged for movers to come for my belongings, had canceled my utilities, and had even contacted my doctor to transfer my medical records. The assumption that I would comply with their plan was so complete that they had already begun dismantling my life. I asked her where David was, why he wasn't here to discuss this decision with me himself. Stephanie's expression hardened slightly, as she explained that David had found this whole process very difficult, that my resistance to their help was causing him tremendous stress, and that he had asked her to handle the practical arrangements because he was too emotionally invested. To think clearly, she made it sound like I was being cruel by questioning their decision, like my desire to maintain my independence was somehow selfish and inconsiderate. The manipulation was so skillful that for a moment I almost felt guilty for not being more grateful. They were offering me safety and security, she reminded me, a chance to live without worry about accidents or emergencies, or the daily challenges of maintaining a household. Thousands of people would be thrilled to have the opportunity. I was rejecting, she said, and my stubbornness was not only ungrateful but potentially dangerous to my own well-being. But when I continued to refuse to sign the papers, when I told her firmly that I was not moving anywhere, and that they had no right to make these arrangements without my consent, Stephanie's mask finally slipped completely. She stood up from my armchair, gathering her papers with sharp, angry movements, and told me that she had tried to do this the easy way, but that I was making it unnecessarily difficult for everyone. That was when she delivered the ultimatum that would change everything. If I would not go to Golden Years Manor voluntarily, she said, then I would have to find somewhere else to live immediately. She and David could no longer enable my unsafe living situation by allowing me to stay in this house, where I was clearly a danger to myself and potentially to others. I had until the end of the day to pack whatever I could carry, because tomorrow morning she would be changing the locks and securing the property. I stared at her, certain I had misunderstood. "This was my house," I said. "I had lived here for 37 years, had raised my son here, had built my life here. She could not simply evict me from my own home." That was when Stephanie smiled her coldest smile and pulled one more document from her folder. It was a deed transfer form, she explained, one that David and I had supposedly signed months ago during one of our financial discussions. According to this document, I had transferred ownership of my house to David in exchange for his promise to care for me in my old age. I had never signed such a document, had never even discussed such an arrangement, but there was my signature at the bottom of the page, witnessed and notarized. The signature looked like mine, but I had no memory of signing anything that would give away my home. Stephanie watched my confusion with satisfaction, explaining that sometimes older people forgot important legal transactions, especially when they were dealing with cognitive decline. The important thing was that the transfer was legal and binding, and that meant David had every right to decide who could and could not live in the house. The room began to spin as I realized the depth of their deception. Somehow they had manipulated me into signing away my home, probably during one of those conversations about organizing my paperwork or simplifying my finances. I had trusted them completely, had signed papers without reading them carefully because they were my family, and I believed they had my best interests at heart. Now I was discovering that my trust had been weaponized against me, used to steal the foundation of my security and independence. Stephanie was still talking, explaining that this was really for the best, that the stress of property ownership was clearly too much for me, and that David would make sure the house was properly maintained and eventually sold for fair market value. She spoke about my situation as if it were a business transaction being concluded, rather than a family being torn apart by greed and manipulation. Her tone was professional and detached, as if she were a social worker discussing the placement of a difficult client rather than a daughter-in-law destroying the life of the woman who had welcomed her into the family. When I asked to speak to David, to hear this decision from him directly, Stephanie told me he was teaching and could not be disturbed. But she had his full authority to handle this matter, she said, and delaying would only make things more complicated for everyone involved. She made it clear that this conversation was a formality, that the decisions had already been made and implemented, and that my only choice was whether to go quietly to the facility they had chosen or to leave and find my own accommodations elsewhere. I cannot describe the feeling of betrayal that washed over me in that moment. It was not just the loss of my home, devastating as that was. It was the realization that the people I loved most in the world had been systematically planning my destruction for months, had been lying to my face while stealing my security, had been presenting themselves as caring family members while actually viewing me as an obstacle to be removed and an asset to be acquired. Stephanie checked her watch with impatience and informed me that she had other appointments that day, so I needed to make my decision quickly. Golden Years Manor was still willing to accept me, she said, but only if I arrived before 5 o'clock. Otherwise, I would need to make my own arrangements, and she suggested I think carefully about whether I had anywhere else to go.